Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 15. Well, we've talked about him several times in the past, but today we finally get to meet Brigadier Etienne Gerard of the Hussars of Conflans in two of his exploits, namely how the Brigadier held the King and how the King held the Brigadier. And here's Paul to introduce the stories.
How the Brigadier held the King. It is July the 1st, 1810, and Colonel Etienne Gerard of the French 3rd Hussars is recuperating from a lance wound to his ankle in the Spanish village of Alamo. He is desperate to be back in the field with his regiment, who are quartered 40 miles away in Pastores and involved in operations around the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. All he needs is a horse, but none is to be found. His prayers are answered by a kindly old Spanish priest, who offers Gerard passage across the mountains in a rickety old diligence. But the priest is not all he appears to be, and Gerard finds himself the prisoner of a unit of Spanish guerrillas, led by the notorious and bloodthirsty marauder known as El Cuchillo. Yet just as Gerard is steeling himself to face an horrendous death, salvation appears in an unlikely form. How the King held the Brigadier. Following his capture in Spain, Gerard is held in Dartmoor prison, as he has refused to grant his parole and consequently cannot be quartered upon an English family. Once behind the grim walls, he thinks only of escaping, which, against the odds, he does. Once free, however, he has to contend with the Moor, his pursuers, and some curious encounters with the locals. And then fate intervenes with an ironic twist.
So 2 linked stories there to introduce Brigadier Gerard to the podcast. Now, we've spoken about Conan Doyle and his fascination with the Napoleonic era a few times in the podcast. On episode 10, we talked about A Straggler of 15 and Waterloo. And on episode 12, we had a conversation with Cliff Goldfarb about all things Gerard and Napoleon. But just to quickly recap, before Conan Doyle started work on the Brigadier Gerard stories, he'd already written a number of Napoleonic pieces. There was A Straggler of 15, the short story, in 1891, which he adapted into the play Waterloo in 1892. And he also wrote a short serialized novel, The Great Shadow, which came out towards the end of 1892 as well. And these stories are important forerunners because by the time Conan Doyle had reached Gerard, he was expert in the Napoleonic era. Having dealt with the heavy historical lifting in other tales, he was now free from that burden of historical accuracy and could have more fun with the pieces. And they were, as Hesketh Pearson noted, flights of fancy for Conan Doyle. They were his great entertainments set against the backdrop of the Napoleonic era. And the 2 stories that we're focusing on here today were the second and the third Gerard stories to be written. The first, The Medal of Brigadier Gerard, was written sometime before a series was ever devised. Conan Doyle said he began writing the series of Gerard stories in Davos over the winter of 1893-4, although it's highly unlikely that that was the case. He may well have started on the idea of Gerard, but he didn't really decide on a series of Gerard stories until a full 12 months later. And there's a difference of opinion over when the Medal of Brigadier Gerard was written. One school of thought has it that it was written in Britain in the early part of 1894. Another is that it was actually written in the latter half of 1894 when Conan Doyle was on a lecture tour of North America. Whatever the truth, we know that he certainly read the Medal of Brigadier Gerard to audiences in North America and received extremely positive feedback, most notably from Sam McClure, the founder and editor of McClure's magazine. McClure's magazine was actually in some financial difficulty towards the end of 1894, and Conan Doyle stumped up £1,000 to invest in the company. And it was a very sound investment because McClure's actually doubled its circulation on, perhaps not coincidentally, a serialized feature on Napoleon by Ida Tarbell, which led to McClure's growing enormously in circulation and became one of the most successful American periodicals of its day. So McClure was clearly very interested in Napoleon and very receptive to Conan Doyle's first Gerard story, and may well have encouraged him to think more about writing other Gerard tales. As it happened, the Medal of Brigadier Gerard didn't appear in McClure's magazine. Instead, Conan Doyle wrote a related Napoleonic story for McClure, which was entitled A Foreign Office Romance, which is often seen as one of the apocrypha of Gerard. It's a story that really sets up the framing device of the elderly Frenchman telling tales of his past. Whatever the case of the writing of the Medal of Brigadier Gerard, he'd certainly decided on a series by the end of 1894. On the 18th of December, he wrote to Arthur Waugh from the Reform Club saying that he was going to write a series and offer the stories to the Strand for £250 each. Conan Doyle then set off for Switzerland for a second time, and it was there that he wrote the Gerard stories that became what were known as the exploits of Brigadier Gerard. We know that at least 5 of the 8 tales of the exploits were written from the Hotel Belvedere in Davos-Platz in Switzerland, with various dates between January and May 1895. The first one, How the Brigadier Held the King, was completed by the 2nd of January, and the second, How the King Held the Brigadier, by the 24th of January, which just goes to show the remarkable speed at which Conan Doyle was able to write these stories. We know that How the King Held the Brigadier was certainly written by the 24th because there is a letter between Conan Doyle and George Newnes in which Conan Doyle wishes the new series to be known as The Exploits, whereas Newnes is keen on The Adventures, but Conan Doyle is rather more dismissive, having just released The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes a few years previously. The Gerard stories were then published in the Strand between April and September 1895, with the final of the exploits, How the Brigadier Played for a Kingdom, appearing a little later in December 1895. And the stories were collected as a volume entitled The Exploits of Brigadier Gerard, which came out in mid-February 1896. And in the book edition, the stories are compiled in chronological order, with the Medal of Brigadier Gerard renamed How the Brigadier Won His Medal, thus beginning the rather long and convoluted story of the different changes to titles and the running order of the Gerard stories themselves. And the stories are very much part of a revival of interest in the Napoleonic era more broadly.
Yeah, this sort of time from the mid to late 1880s through into the early 20th century, there's a real explosion of interest in the Napoleonic era. You've got in 1890 the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, and then the 80th anniversary in 1895. And people are also realizing that the last of the veterans are dying off at this time as well. So there's this kind of recognition of this. This is an era which is fast disappearing from living history. And there's a whole raft of published works which come out at the time. I mean, Conan Doyle is producing most of his fictional Napoleonic works in the 1890s, but there's a great raft of non-fiction works as well, which come out to feed this interest. I'm thinking, for instance, of books like E.L.S. Horsborough's study of Waterloo, A Narrative and a Criticism, which is published in 1895. There's a 5th edition of William Sybourne's classic study of Waterloo, which comes out in 1900. A new edition of J.G. Lockhart's study of Napoleon is published in 1897. J.R. Seeley publishes A Life of Napoleon in 1886. And then there's a great 2-volume Life of Napoleon by John Holland Rose in 1901. These are all catching on to this. And then perhaps very significantly for Conan Doyle, Henry Houssaye, the French historian, writes a 3-volume history of Waterloo, which is translated into English from its 31st French edition in 1900. And Conan Doyle rated Houssaye's work very highly, saying of it in Through the Magic Door, "Houssaye's book is my favourite. Taken from the French point of view, it gets the actions of the Allies in truer perspective than any English or German account can do." So he really recommends this work. But also, as well as the historians, there's also a great number of Napoleonic memoirs come out at this time. There's one of the ones which Conan Doyle used again was Wellington's Men, which was a collection of British memoirs put together by the historian Fitchett, which came out in 1900. But there's also the French memoirs. So you've got translations of de Marbo's memoirs come out in 1892, Coignier's memoirs in 1897, Burgon in 1899. These are all military memoirs. But then there's also the memoirs of people who worked in the civil as well as the military service. Think of people like de Bourrienne. His memoirs are translated in 1894, and de Segur. And Doyle used all of these as source books for his own Napoleonic fictions.
Yes, and he's very open and explicit about that. In the preface to the author's edition of the Gerard Tales, he says, readers of Marbot, de Gonville, Coignet, de Fezenac, Bourgon, and other French soldiers who've recorded their reminiscences of the Napoleonic campaigns will recognize the fountain from which I have drawn the adventures of Etienne Gerard. And it's probably, of all of them, Marcelin de Marbot is probably the greatest single inspiration, certainly. That's what Conan Doyle says in Memories and Adventures when he reminisces on the writing of the Gerard stories in Davos. He says, "Was there I began the Brigadier Gerard series of stories founded largely upon that great book, the Memoirs of General Marbot. This entailed a great deal of research into Napoleonic days, and my military detail was, I think, very accurate, so much so that I had a warm letter of appreciation from Archibald Forbes, the famous war correspondent, who was himself a great Napoleonic and military student." And Forbes is just one of a number of people who were fascinated by Napoleon and the Napoleonic era. The other great source of inspiration for Conan Doyle is one of his great literary heroes, George Meredith, and it's suggested that Meredith was the individual who recommended Marbot's memoirs to Conan Doyle, and that's the copy, it's believed, that's the copy that he took with him to Davos to read and to draw from. And there is some decent evidence that Conan Doyle borrowed directly from Marbot. There's one moment in How the Brigadier Held the King where Gerard is captured by a fantastic character, the Bart, who will no doubt come on to in a bit. But Gerard doesn't give parole, and he is therefore entitled to escape. But being the generous and chivalric character that he is, he decides he's going to have a conversation with the Bart about this, and instead they decide to play cards for his freedom. But this is very reminiscent, as Hesketh Pearson pointed out, of a scene in Marbot's memoirs where Marbot has captured, I think it's a Polish cavalry officer, and again the Polish cavalry officer hasn't given parole, and Marbot has trusted him with his life, and the Polish cavalry officer takes a sword, swipes at Marbot. Marbot's saddle comes loose, and he rolls to the underside of his horse as the Polish cavalry officer escapes. But there's echoes of Marbot and other instances from the other memoirs littered throughout the Gerard stories. They were clearly a great source of inspiration for Conan Doyle.
Marbot is quite definitely the number one source of inspiration, but Gerard is so much more, of course, than that. And it's all the other Napoleonic memoirs and getting those French attitudes or the sort of what are seen as French attitudes taken from these books. But Gerard is very, very much taken from other sources as well, including fictional sources. It's very much he's an Alexandre Dumas character, as well as being a really believable historical character. And it's particularly interesting when there's a biography of Marbot appears in English in 1946, written by Vivian Ferrers, who wrote the book while he was in a German prison camp. But he actually calls this biography of Marbot the Brigadier.
Oh,
because
interesting.
of the influence of Marbot on Gerard. So just this crossover between fact and fiction and how easily they become mixed up. It's just shown by this example.
Also, when you're thinking about Dumas, the other connection there is that D'Artagnan is a Gascon, and Gerard is a Gascon as well. He's another of from a great long line of dramatic Frenchmen who appear throughout literature.
These Gascon swashbucklers.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you raised there about the Frenchness of Gerard, because that's the heart of the character. But, it's not an offensive stereotype, this, at all. It's a very affectionate stereotype. And Conan Doyle plays heavily in both of these stories on the differences between the phlegmatic English character and the more flamboyant French character. But it's always in a very affectionate way. There was a great commentary on this from John Dixon Carr in his biography of Conan Doyle, where he says, the Brigadier is truly French as Marbot, as French as Coignet, as French as Gauguin. Not a word or a gesture is false. The attitudes he strikes, which so annoy his English foes and amuse us who read, are perfectly sincere. He is life and soul in the Grande Armée. His own throat nearly bursts with the war whoop of Vive l'Empereur, and his own hits at English character are fully as good as anything they ever say about him. Etienne Gerard makes a fool only of himself. He never makes a fool of France or the French. That is the triumph both of the Brigadier and of Conan Doyle. I think that really sums up very nicely that the affection Conan Doyle clearly has for the French. And you mentioned actually in the podcast with Cliff that it's interesting that Conan Doyle chooses as his great hero from this period a Frenchman as opposed to an Englishman.
Yes, so you look at the wars in a different perspective, and again with this whole late 19th century Napoleonic nostalgia, because there's the distance is there now that we can look at. Napoleon isn't an actual threat anymore, and this ability to look at the wars in a different way and admire the other side as well. And I think while we're on this sort of subject, it is worth pointing out as well that Conan Doyle, was very much a Francophile and brought up to read French by his mother, who was similarly disposed towards the French. I mean, he talks of her reading the Revue des Deux Mondes and him being brought up on this as a background. So he can look with great sympathy on the French side in the Napoleonic Wars. And of course he could read French, so he didn't have to wait for the translations of a lot of these memoirs. He could read them in the original.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing about Conan Doyle's depiction of Gerard, I think, is that for all Gerard is this exaggeration in a whole range of different ways, he's also quite plausible. He's also a tremendous optimist. There's a wonderful moment in the first of the two stories we're looking at where he's really backed into a corner, and he says, one lesson which I've learned in my roaming life, my friends, is never to call anything a misfortune until you have seen the end of it. Is not every hour a fresh point of view? There's this sort of endless optimism, and he lives in the moment so much, and that's what gives the pacing and the storytelling such immense movement and speed. The other thing about Gerard is that as much as he's often talked about as being this entertaining character, very light character, he's also an incredibly good soldier. He's very brave, he's very impulsive, he's incredibly capable, and so he actually comes across as being strangely believable. For all it's a heightened reality, he comes across as being strangely believable because he's motivated by those principles of patriotism and of chivalric ideals and pride, which makes him prone to folly, but also makes him an enchanting character in his own way.
And this is also why the framing device works so well as well, because after the wars, he's adrift.
Yeah.
It's, as you say, in the time of the wars, he lives in the moment, and it feels to him like the empire will go on forever. How could it ever end when it's led by this wonderful man Napoleon? And when it is all over, Gerard, far from living in the moment, then lives in the past.
He does, and there's tremendous pathos from all those moments as well. And that's that's the other great thing about the Gerard stories, I think, is the tonal shifts, often within the space of a single short story. But they're always rooted in a historical reality. And there's a sense in which Conan Doyle was trying to do something slightly different with Gerard. While he was writing the Gerard stories in Davos in Switzerland, he wrote to James Payn and said, it's a funny thing that our idea of an historical novel is always something at or before the Jacobite times, simply because that was Scott's idea of one. We forget that a longer interval separates us now from Napoleon than separated Scott from Prince Charlie. No attempt has been made to idealise and turn into fiction Napoleon, Ney, Murat, and all those wonderful fellows. Erckmann Chatrian gives a narrative of campaigns from a peasant's point of view, but there's no character drawing of the big men. And you do get the fleeting characters of the marshals and little pen portraits of key historical figures littered throughout the Gerard stories. And there's a notable cameo at the end of How the Brigadier Held the King, which we'll probably come on to as well. And that nicely brings us to the first of the two short stories that we're looking at today, How the Brigadier Held the King, which is one of, I think, 5 of the Gerard stories that is set in Spain and during the Peninsular War.
The Peninsular War, as its name may suggest, took place on the Iberian Peninsula and broke out in November 1807 when the Portuguese refused to impose Napoleon's blockade on trading with England. So Napoleon sent General Junot in to try and sort the Portuguese out. Through this movement, to simplify it grossly, the French got sucked into Spanish politics. Napoleon found himself embroiled in Spanish political intrigues, as well as coming to the decision that he would actually need to take over the Iberian Peninsula himself. And he tried to impose his own brother Joseph as King of Spain. The war itself became terribly bogged down. There were elements of conventional warfare, but what Napoleon encountered in Spain was the growth of guerrilla warfare, which is where the phrase first comes about, and found himself fighting a people's war. And the whole thing just bogged the French army down. Napoleon himself was actually only involved in Spain for 77 days. He left most of the running of the campaign to his marshals, with greater or lesser success.
Yes.
But the particular time of the setting of this story is 1810, during another attempted invasion of Portugal by the French. And Gerard and his regiment find themselves involved in the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo, which was a strategically important fortress on the River Agueda, which guarded an exit of the northern corridor which linked Spain and Portugal. To be blockaded by Marshal Ney since February 1810, and then was invested and besieged from late May. It was held by a Spanish garrison of only 5,000 to 6,500 men, commanded by Don Andres Haresti. And it finally fell on the 9th of July when French engineers blew a breach in the defences. But Gerard's own troops were involved, not in the siege itself, but in operations around the siege.
As would have been the case for hussars, because that's their primary role.
Yes, scouting and skirmishing.
And around that siege, there is this incredibly brutal guerrilla war going on, and it's into the hands of a band of Spanish guerrillas that Gerard falls.
Yes, it's a particularly brutal band that he's actually captured by, and the whole guerrilla war in Spain is itself a pretty complicated picture. You would have bands of different sizes. Some of them were uniform, some of them were semi-regular, some of them were just out-and-out bandits who took advantage of the chaos around them to enrich themselves and just enjoy themselves with a bit of mayhem and disguise their own criminal tendencies behind a mask of patriotism. It's by one of these latter bands that Gerard is captured, and they're headed by a particularly notorious character who goes under the name of El Cuchillo, the knife. But again, to show the whole complexity of this war, El Cuchillo has this bloodthirsty reputation where when Gerard meets him face to face, he describes him. His face was bluff and broad and bland, with ruddy cheeks and comfortable little tufts of side whiskers, which gave him the appearance of a well-to-do grocer of the Rue Saint-Antoine. He had not any of those flaring sashes or gleaming weapons which distinguished his followers, but on the contrary, he wore a good broadcloth coat, like a respectable father of a family, and save for his brown leggings, there was nothing to indicate a life among the mountains. And he's also a poet.
Yes.
We don't know really, because it's Gerard telling the story. We don't know really whether he's a good or a bad poet, but Gerard indicates to him that he's a bad poet simply to wind him up.
Yes, indeed. And that's a wonderful pen portrait of El Cuchillo, isn't it? I
Mm,
mean,
mm.
Conan Doyle is so good at just describing somebody in a handful of sentences. And certainly the character had a great influence on at least one other reader, and that was George Bernard Shaw, because in his play Man and Superman, he has a character who is based directly on the character of El Cuchillo from How the Brigadier Held the King. He wrote in the preface to Man and Superman, "I should make formal acknowledgment to the authors whom I have pillaged in the following pages, if I could recollect them all. The theft of the brigand poetaster from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is deliberate."
And if the character himself sounds like a bit of almost of a cartoon character, especially with his name, El
Mm.
Cuchillo, there are plenty of real life owls that were found amongst the guerrilla bands in the Peninsular War, most of whom were actually named after their leaders. So, for example, you have El Marquesito, the little Marquis, El Empecinado, the obstinate, El Estudiante, the student, El Pastor, the shepherd, and one I particularly like, El Manco, one arm. So, these characters, real life, but they're also almost straight out of the pages of early to mid 19th century melodrama.
Yeah.
Although this may all sound very, very sort of stagey and melodramatic, it mustn't be forgotten that the setting of the story itself, it is a very brutal insurgent war,
Mm.
which Napoleon hadn't encountered before. He was used to fighting conventional battles,
Yes.
and he would encounter this again when he invaded Russia in 1812. And throughout the 19th century, this type of warfare will become more and more, if not the norm, certainly a part of warfare as we get a succession of wars of national liberation
Mm.
throughout the century. And the French, who had experienced this at the hands of the Spanish and the Russians in the Napoleonic Wars, actually would turn to these tactics themselves in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 in the form of their own semi-regular units, the Franc-Tireurs,
Mm.
who terrorized the Prussian forces who invaded France in 1870. And they also caught Conan Doyle's imagination, as he wrote another Gothic-themed historical story around this in 1894 called The Lord of Chateau Noir.
Yeah. Yeah, the Lord of Chateau Noir. And the brutality of the conflict really allows Conan Doyle to play with his love of the Gothic once again.
Yes, you get this even beginning as Gerard is led into the guerrillas' mountain hideaway. A narrow pathway led through the brambles to a deep grotto in the side of the cliff. The sun was already setting outside, and in the cave itself it would have been quite dark, but for a pair of torches which blazed from a socket on either side. So you're already getting this
Mm.
again, this kind of 19th century stage setup of this is the robber's hideaway. It's the
Mm.
kind of thing Gilbert and Sullivan spoofed in the Pirates of Penzance.
Mm.
Talking of the Victorian melodramatic stage, there's a what appears to be a direct reference to one of the favourite popular plays of the era, when Gerard is talking about the guerrilla band and El Cuchillo. He laughed as he spoke, and at the sight of it, the whole 40 of them laughed also, which is a pretty clear reference to everyone's favourite pantomime, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And then similarly, you've got as Gerard is led out to be executed by the guerrillas. It was quite dark when we came out, and the moon was shining very clearly in the heavens. The brigands had lighted a great fire of the dried branches of the fir trees, not, of course, for warmth, since the night was already very sultry, but to cook their evening meal. A huge copper pot hung over the blaze, and the rascals were lying all round in the yellow glare. so that the scene looked like one of those pictures which Juno stole out of Madrid. So you've got him again playing with this kind of Gothic picture book quality of the scene, and you almost saw where he's talking about the pictures which Juno stole out of Madrid. I wonder if Conan Doyle was also thinking, or one of the moonlit pictures that his own father, Charles Altamont Doyle, specialised in these kind of Gothic scenes.
Yeah, I mean, and the other inspiration is probably Goya. Goya's did a series of prints between 1810 and 1820, which are, I think, collectively known as the Disasters of War. And they're really interesting in that they start by depicting really the horrors inflicted by the French on the Spanish populace. But in the later illustrations, it's harder to really ascribe the brutality to one side over the other. There's also a sort of schoolboyish love of the Gothic torture as well. The death that the brigands have in mind for Gerard is essentially to tension two trees and then to tie him to the two, tie one leg to one and one leg to the other, and essentially split him in half. It's pretty horrible stuff. And there's also a wonderful moment of dark comedy in that when El Cuchillo mentions that they've already had a member of the Hussar of Conflans with them, a chap called Soubiron. El Cuchillo consults his notes and says, "Ah, yes, I see we buried him upon that date. Poor lad," I cried. "And how did he die?" "We buried him." "But before you buried him?" "You misunderstand me, Colonel. He was not dead before we buried him." There's a wonderful dark comedy around this as well.
And the particular method of death chosen for Soubiron could also reflect Conan Doyle's love of Edgar Allan Poe's works, because Poe was very fond of discussing premature burials.
Yes, indeed. And just as the tension is reaching fever pitch and it looks like Gerard has no hope, we suddenly have the arrival of a British officer who casually comes in and says, "Well, well, well," cried the young officer in sufficiently bad French, "what game are you up to here? Who was that who was yelling for help, and what are you trying to do to him?" This fantastic, phlegmatic Englishman who goes by the name of the Bart, because Gerard doesn't understand that the suffix Bart is short for baronet. And for all the Bart is a English stereotype, he still comes across as quite a plausible character.
Yeah, and when he stumbles upon the scene of Gerard about to be executed in this particularly unpleasant way, his English sensibilities of fair play are certainly offended by what's going on, and also as a regular soldier, he has this clear distaste for what he will see as a group of bandits. And it was this difficult interplay between the regular forces of England and Portugal and Spain as well, although the Spanish regular forces didn't perform particularly well throughout the war. But the distaste of the regular soldier for the irregular, and their understanding that there was this point where some of the guerrillas were out and out bandits, and the Bart has pretty well summed up El Cuchillo as an out and out villain. And this is comes across particularly well in this story, and in this group of English dragoons almost immediately takes the side of the French officer who is their nominal enemy. And take a dislike to this group of bandits, and they help Gerard to get away. And in one of the delicious irony of the story, it's an English sergeant who actually finishes El Cuchillo's career.
Yeah, and then hot on the heels of the Bart's rescue of Gerard, we are introduced to two other historical figures of rather more note.
Yes, two of the leading British commanders, including the commander-in-chief, the Duke of Wellington, and General Crawford, are actually stood watching Gerard and the Bart play cards in the middle of a war zone. And secretly, they're probably amused, but they can't stand for this sort of behaviour. So the Bart has to be admonished like a naughty schoolboy by his commander-in-chief. But it's a lovely portrait of Wellington. And again, this whole idea of Conan Doyle and his love of historical accuracy, and Crawford and Wellington were certainly in the area at the time, so it's not taking characters out of their place. It is, from the historical accuracy perspective, it is slightly disappointing to note that when Conan Doyle describes the original arrival of the Bart and his group of dragoons, he says of the Bart, he wore a singular coat which had once been red all over, but which was now stained to the colour of a withered oak leaf wherever the weather could reach it. His shoulder straps, however, were of golden lace, and he had a bright metal helmet upon his head, with a coquettish white plume upon one side of its crest. Unfortunately, at this period, the 16th Light Dragoons were certainly in Spain at this period, but their uniforms were they wore dark blue jackets of the Hussar style, and the helmets were black leather tarlatan style. So Conan Doyle he might have done this deliberately, to point out that these are British troops. He's put them into red coats.
Into red as opposed to
It
blue.
might just be the choice of a novelist. I might be being a bit unfair there, but yeah.
Very good, very good.
And on that point as well, the illustrator William Wallen does get the Bart's uniform right in the illustrations, but unfortunately he saddles Gerard with a large pair of epaulets, which would never be worn on a hussar jacket.
And there has long been this confusion about Gerard's rank.
Yes, when Conan Doyle called him Brigadier Gerard, he was intending brigadier to be taken almost in its British sense of being a lower-ranking general, whereas brigadier in the French army, so in the French cavalry, is actually corporal, which Conan Doyle certainly didn't intend. At the time of the later Gerard stories, he has actually risen to become colonel commanding the 3rd Hussars, but he's also chef de brigade, which is a title meaning brigade major or brigade staff officer, which is why, for instance, in the two stories set in the 1814 French campaign, he's galloping around carrying messages.
Yeah.
The actual rank in the British Army, brigadier, has no direct French equivalent, even in General de Brigade, because in the French Army, General de Brigade doesn't have to command a brigade. It's all a more free-flowing title. So in the end, I think we just have to accept Brigadier Gerard is the high-ranking French cavalry officer and leave it at that.
And while Conan Doyle might be playing a little fast and loose with the regimental details, he certainly gives Wellington probably the best line of the first story, in that he gets the punchline. Gerard has Gerard's card game with the Bart has been interrupted at a critical moment, and he says, "See, my lord," I cried, "I played for my freedom and I won, for as you perceive, I hold the king." For the first time, a slight smile softened his gaunt face. "On the contrary," said he, as he mounted his horse, "it was I who won, for as you perceive, my king holds you." Which leads us nicely into the second story, how the king held the brigadier, and this couldn't be more different in terms of tone from the Gothic horrors of the first story to what is essentially a comedy story, with plenty of dark moments sprinkled across it, but really a sort of three-part farce or comic story. The first part being about Dartmoor and the escape from the prison. The second part about his encounters with a particularly well-drawn local boxer called the Bristol Bustler, and then the denouement with the reveal as to what has been going on all this time. So tonally, incredibly different from the first story, and that's what makes these two stories a really interesting pair. But again, Conan Doyle is drawing on his knowledge and experience and themes he's explored in previous stories, notably in the setting, yet again, of Dartmoor.
Yes, this is his third foray into using Dartmoor as a location in his fiction. He used it in The Winning Shot, which was published in 1883, which we discussed in episode 2. And also Silver Blaze in 1892, the first of the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And so here we are putting Gerard into Dartmoor prison, which would feature in the background in his next use of Dartmoor, and most famous use of Dartmoor, The Hound of the Baskervilles, in 1901.
Mm. And Conan Doyle is demonstrating a great interest and knowledge of the local Dartmoor history. Dartmoor Prison was established as a jail for prisoners of war during the Napoleonic era, and it became home first to French soldiers captured during the conflict on the continent, but also held some American prisoners of war during the War of 1812. And during the time that the French were incarcerated in Dartmoor Prison, they developed their own rules and systems and their own governance of their own behaviour as well. And some of that comes out in the opening of the story.
Yes, the prisoners were particularly tough on prisoners who informed on escape plots to the British authorities. And there's another wonderfully Gothic moment when Gerard is describing the results of this sort of treachery. That night there was a trial with a whispered accusation and a whispered defence, a gagged prisoner and a judge whom none could see. In the morning, when they came for their man with papers for his release, there was not as much of him left as you could put upon your thumbnail. They were ingenious people, those prisoners, and they had their own way of managing.
And when Gerard inevitably escapes from Dartmoor Prison, he does so in dramatic fashion. There's a really interesting, quite dark moment where he's actually betrayed by another prisoner. It's played for laughs. But it then results in this quite vicious battle between Gerard and the soldier, where Gerard thinks he might have actually clubbed him to death.
The relationship between Gerard and his cellmate Beaumont is particularly intriguing, as it shows almost a regimental rivalry, because Beaumont is of the flying artillery, the horse artillery, who were the more dashing end of the artillerists. And Gerard, being hussar, thinks this man thinks like he does. Yeah. And he'd say, you won't be long till you're back to your guns. And he doesn't understand that Beaumont doesn't want to get back to his guns. Beaumont is quite happy. He's got a cushy billet here, away from guns and fighting. And he doesn't want to escape. And Gerard is just incapable of understanding this.
Yeah, that's true. And then Gerard finds himself on the moor, and then we get a different treatment of the moor again from Conan Doyle.
Yeah, each story he writes with the moor as a setting, almost as a character. He changes its mood. So in The Winning Shot, even though that's a Gothic vampire story, the moor is depicted usually in quite a positive light. It's where people go picnicking. It's where they live. It's a pleasant environment, apart from this Swedish vampire wandering about on it
with his salad.
And in the in Silver Blaze, it's a working environment where it's very much shown the working life of a racing stables on the moor. And in The Hound of the Baskervilles, after the Gerard story, it's a purely Gothic location that is played for all it's worth. But in Gerard, you've got an element of that. It is this wilderness where they've planted this prisoner of war establishment. So the prisoners are almost in the middle of a sea. But it's a hostile environment, but it is also the beauty of its nature comes out in this story as well.
Yeah. Well, Gerard certainly gets to see plenty of it, since he then spends...
Twice.
He spends much of this story running around, not knowing where he's going. And the farcical element sort of comes to a head when he encounters this wonderful character, the Bristol Bustler, an English prize fighter. Although, of course, Gerard doesn't realise he's an English prize fighter. He just thinks he's an Englishman wearing some clothes that Gerard would very much like, so that he can disguise his appearance. But there are a few things that are great about the moment with the Bristol Bustler. The first is Conan Doyle's fantastic use of dialect. In this case, you have the wonderful conversation between the bustler and his trainer. "Well, strike me," said the bustler. "I don't often break my training, but when it comes to giving up my clothes to a Frenchie, you couldn't hit a dint in a pat of butter. Well, it's more than I can swallow." It's just fantastic. And of course, Gerard's response, "Be jabers," said I shall have no choice but to take them." And this is this Fantastic little aside about Gerard, that Gerard learnt his English from a member of the Irish Legion, O'Brien, on a previous campaign.
Yes, it's great to note that Conan Doyle, with his own Irish family background, has noticed the presence of this Irish Legion in Napoleon's army.
Mm.
The Legion itself wasn't entirely Irish. It had members from all four corners of Europe, but it was uniformed in green and was officered by a number of Irishmen, a lot of whom were veterans of the 1798 Irish uprising who had to leave Ireland in a hurry. But there's also historical accuracy because the 2nd and 3rd Battalion of the Irish Legion were stationed at Burgos in Spain in 1810. So Conan Doyle has presumably spotted this and and again used it for historical and comic purpose at the same time.
And Conan Doyle's very good at giving these little incidental details that give you a real sense of time and place. One of the things that's going on around the time of this story is Conan Doyle's interest in the Regency and how he actually starts a bit of his own Doylean verse of Regency England. In the case of the Bristol Bustler, there's obviously the interest in boxing, which permeates a lot of Conan Doyle's fiction around this time. In 1896, he wrote the novel Rodney Stone, and boxing is central to that. But you also get characters appearing in multiple stories. There's a casual reference to the Bristol Bustler being backed by Lord Rufton. And Rufton appears in The House of Temperley and also in a short story called The End of Devil Hawker. And thinking back to the Bart in the previous story, we learn that the Bart is a member of Watier's, which was a private club set up by the Prince Regent and had Beau Brummel as its president. Beau Brummel makes a fleeting appearance in Rodney Stone. And in fact, Watier's is also referenced in The House of Temperley and another Conan Doyle short story called An Impression of the Regency. So Conan Doyle is starting to build his own world of interlinked characters, and he comes back to this again later in the Gerard stories in a lovely little short story called The Brigadier in England.
Yeah, and on the subject of names and the Regency, we actually have one part of this story where Gerard almost ends up playing the highwayman.
Yes.
When he finds a coach in trouble and thinks, oh, I might be able to find some money or some clothes in this coach, and of course there's a lovely woman in it, and he pays her court and so on. But she is, it turns out, Lady Meredith, wife of Sir Charles Meredith, and there could be two references with Sir Charles Meredith, and one is to George Meredith, who, as you pointed out, Mark, directed Doyle towards Marbo's memoirs. But we've also got Sir Charles, and in the later Dartmoor story, The Hound of the Baskervilles, we have Sir Charles Baskerville. But for all that there is a minor Gothic key, Conan Doyle turns Gothicism on its head in a way when he talks about Gerard's nightmares when he's in Dartmoor prison, and then they're not nightmares of war or horror or being incarcerated. I had dreadful nightmares in which I fancied that the whole regiment needed shoeing, or that my horses were all bloated with green fodder, or that they were foundered from bogland, or that 6 squadrons were clubbed in the presence of the Emperor. Such is the stuff that Gerard's nightmares are made of.
And that brings us back to the heart of these stories, which is the character of Gerard himself. And this story, as a classic farce, has a wonderful farcical punchline in that we discover that in the coat that Gerard has acquired from this lady in a carriage is actually the letter that would see him freed from Dartmoor prison and released back to his beloved France. But he's been too busy running around Dartmoor for anybody to be able to catch him or indeed to read the letter. And it's a great story. I think these two stories together really sum up the breadth and range and all there is to love about the Gerard stories. There is action and adventure. There is excitement. There is the wonderful moments of bleak horror, particularly in the first story, through to that heightened note of farce right at the end. And, it's a shame in a way that Conan Doyle regarded them a bit like he did the Sherlock Holmes stories as well, that they were flights of fancy. As Hesketh Pearson noted, Doyle did not place these stories among his highest flights of fiction, no doubt because, like those of Holmes, they were the natural product of his fancy. He wrote them with relative ease, and travail was his watchword. But the fact that they were easy to write is no reason to denigrate them. They are full of verve and enthusiasm and character, in a way that some of the other writing of Conan Doyle around this time, I'm thinking particularly of things like Uncle Bernac, which is heavily laden with a sort of historical mission to tell a particular story. Conan Doyle is freed from all of that in the Gerard stories. He can just have fun.
Yeah, I personally think the Gerard stories are his best historical fiction, because he is relaxed while he's writing them. He's absorbed all this knowledge already in writing the other Napoleonic stories, and it is almost like he's channeling the memoirs that he's read, and really captures the period. And he's not doing it in a way which is laden with heavy mission. These stories are written for entertainment, but they educate as well. He doesn't overwhelm you with it.
So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you'd like to read the show notes, they're available at doingsofdoyle.com, or you can follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. And Paul, what have we got in store for next time?
Next time, we have a slice of Anglo-Indian Gothic in the shape of Uncle Jeremy's household.
Great. And lots of Sherlockian connections in that one as well. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Yes, and amid all of this Gothic horror, as the tension is really reaching fever pitch and it looks like our hero is going to suffer a fate worse than death. No, that's not. He's going to suffer actually death. He's going to actually suffer death. Oh dear, there's the outtake.
Absolutely.